want to talk about posture. Posture will help us with our athletic performance by giving us just less restriction throughout our normal day and using gravity for us rather than against us. So we all sit probably more than we should. Sitting turns off our glutes, which is our most powerful muscle. So we want to be able to activate that as much as we can. And the more we can use the glutes when we're running, skiing, biking, the better. It really helps protect our spine and it helps stabilize the pelvis. So for any kind of low back soreness, that can often be your glutes not working. The hamstrings can often get overworked, can cause tendonitis and things like that. So this is a little bit just a primer on how I think about posture and being in a position to be able to move economically. So basically we have flexion and extension. So flexion is everything forward, like this, like fetal position. That's the ultimate flexion. And then extension is this, so we're going out. When we're running, we're continually going between flexion and extension in the hip, flexion, extension. Another way that we can actually use our extensors though in the running phase is when you land, you can then pull up with your posterior chain to engage those muscles and bring you forward. So that's also why for stabilizing, we do all of the muscles for the lateral side is to keep you in a good position here in that stance phase versus here or hinging up like this. So you see hip drop a lot, but why we want to keep stable is so then we can use our glutes. So if we're here, our glute isn't going to be able to fire. So we really want to be putting ourselves in the position to be able to move in the easiest way. That's why deadlifts, squats, all those things are sport specific because we're really wanting to get that hip drive and we want to ingrain those movement patterns. So loading can actually help you recruit more muscles and get that full hip extension, especially if we sit a lot. So if you sit a lot at work, it could be that when you stand up, you're still like this versus full hip extension. So practice where you are just normally in space. And then the other thing that is often, that I often see is people sitting on the backs of their heels, backs of their feet. So the other thing with running that we want, if you're here, it's really going to be hard to use your extensors. But if you're up here with your center of gravity up over your arches, then all of a sudden you're in a much better position to be able to use extension. Because obviously, if you're back here, it uses a lot more power versus here. So keeping the rib cage over the pelvis. So if you imagine that your pelvis is a bowl and your rib cage is kind of a backwards bowl, you want those to be moving at the same, in the same plane versus here or here and then your pelvis here. So your sternum should be in line with your pubis bone, which is the bone in the front of the hip. Okay? So just play around with where that is. For many of us, our rib cage is back. So you have to lift your chest to bring that up into the right positioning, and then you might find that all of a sudden, wow, my core has to engage to hold it there. So this can be your core exercise, is just holding this and then keeping your rib cage up over your pelvis also allows your diaphragm to get full breath. If you're really tight in the chest, you're likely mostly using your chest muscles to breathe, which is missing out on a huge resource of our diaphragm. So, but if our rib cage is like this, our diaphragm can't really work properly, or if we're like this, it's compressed and it's not going to be able to fully do the work. So, get into our good posture where our rib cage is up over our pelvis, and then just practice breathing through your nose. And you'll find, when you start, you might just be lifting here, which also is an indicator that you're not using your diaphragm. So the diaphragm pushes air, it's like a balloon when you inhale, and then the pressure naturally will compress the stomach as well on the exhale, so that you can actually use your core. It will help use your core muscles as well. So rib cage over the hips are over the ankles, and your overall weight is pretty much up over your arches. You can kind of play around with what happens, like you could have a friend push down on you when you're on your heels and you kind of will crumble. But if you're up over your arches, that gives you much more support and stability. So anytime you're doing any kind of exercises, find that position first and then do whatever exercise you're doing. Finally, another thing that we do is we will often rotate our hips out, and we don't use our big toe. We're not pushing off the big toe. So one way to engage those muscles is to imagine, this is especially true when you're doing exercises like squats and lunges and anything like that, is we want to ingrain movement patterns that are where we're using the big toe. And so if you imagine that you're screwing your feet into the ground, your right foot screws clockwise and your left foot screws counterclockwise. Or you could also think about imagining that you have a band around your knees, and so you're pushing into that. Immediately that will help engage the other stabilizing hip muscles. So that gives you more support there, and then you find that your feet are more active. So then when you're doing squats, deadlifts, even lunges, single leg things, this is really good for bringing in all of those stabilizers in the hip and then fully through the foot. You're just able to use many more muscles along the chain versus kind of the lazy movement where you're more on your joints. So that puts a lot more pressure on your ligaments, and you'll tire faster. Okay, so play around with your posture, see if you can really be full through the chest, engage your hips, fully extend the hips. You almost might feel a little bit of a stretch in your hip flexors when you fully stand up straight. You can always reset by bringing your arms overhead and then dropping your shoulders and your arms back. That sets your shoulders in the correct position, and then your rib cage will also be in the right spot. Okay, have fun.